My name's GS Khalsa, and I work in technical marketing for storage and availability, focused on the availability side of things. And we've got a fun presentation for you today, so hopefully it will be informative as well. So first off, the disclaimer. I know you've probably been seeing this a lot this week. This presentation in particular, we are going to be talking about some futures things. So just to be clear, these are things that we're working on. There is no implied time frame. We're not definitively doing them. It's things that we're working on. It's places that we're looking to go. If you have feedback, we'd love to hear that. So just to be clear, these are, we're not, anything that is future facing, we're not talking about actual delivery dates or, whether this will actually ever even be a product. But it is things that we're working on. So just wanted to be really clear about that because I don't want any, our revenue recognition people to complain. So.
All right. So I'm Mohan Potteri, and I work with GS, and I work in a different business unit. I focus on business critical apps. And then I work for something called the CPBU, which is where our core is vSphere. And today in our agenda, we're going to talk about the foundations of this, disaster recovery, how it's some history about it, then how virtualization has changed it to some extent. And then after that, we'll move on to how the AWS is going to change. The AWS alliance that we have could potentially change it, and then we'll have a tech preview that GS will show us. So if you think about disaster recovery, right, it's been something that has always been a challenge in the physical world. So particularly because when you talk about business critical apps, there are a lot of different facets that you need to look at. For example, if your critical system goes down, you would probably not be serving your customers, and you'd probably be losing revenue. So it's obviously something that always pilfers up to the top when you have a big disaster. So it's very important that you plan for it and you're also protected against it, right? So from a productivity standpoint, if your systems are down, your users are not able to use it, and that could be a big impact on your revenue and also the ability for you to deliver your products and solutions. The other aspect is compliance. You have to meet a lot of compliance-related objectives, and being prepared for it. Compliance actually stipulates you have a proper DR plan, so that's important as well. Then last but not the least, when you have an outage, like for example, when AWS has an outage, you really hear about it. Everybody talks about it, and that's a big ding on their reputation. So similarly, any company that's public-facing or has a reputation to protect, and so DR is important, right? So if you think about how many of you have worked with legacy disaster recovery in a physical environment where you had to kind of go to SunGuard or other location where you have to build, it is a nightmare of all sorts, right? And so you usually have to have similar hardware. You needed to patch on both sides simultaneously. You had to do a lot of, you couldn't really test easily. So all these things, and so it resulted in a lot of time being spent and a lot of surprises when you actually have a disaster. A lot of the things you promise your business from an RPO or RTO standpoint, you rarely are able to deliver. So this is kind of the old world of physical machines, and now we move on to what vSphere has done, right? With vSphere, the first thing that vSphere came about is for consolidation, obviously. So when you consolidate, you're able to reduce the amount of hardware you have, and that means also in a DR scenario, you don't need as much hardware. So that's very important from a cost perspective, and also, to some extent, it helps you reduce the time to recover, right? Then if you look at hardware independence, in the past, as I said, in the legacy world, you needed physical hardware that was identical. Here, all you need is another x86 platform that can run vSphere. So kind of vSphere brings that. So now you can have different servers in your production environment compared to your DR environment. So that kind of reduces a lot of the complexity involved and problems associated with it. Last but not the least, your VM is encapsulated. What does it mean? Your VM is actually a file. When it's a file, you can move files around. So that makes it easy to actually replicate your entire VM and the data it has from one place to another. So that's these are the things that have been enabled, and over the past many years now, VMware has evolved as disaster recovery. The solution, which is a site recovery manager, as you would see, over time we've evolved and become better at it, right? And so this thing shows you all the aspects of disaster recovery, right? You guys are obviously familiar with VMware HA, DRS. These things also provide some kind of disaster recovery. If you think of a disaster, it can be local, or it can be you lose an entire data center. So primarily, our focus of our talk is going to be obviously a major disaster, but you need to remember that the things like HA, fault tolerance, and DRS kind of helps you avoid a lot of downtime as it is, right? And then these are kind of the different solutions that we have, and then we can leverage. So when you look at a major disaster, you need some kind of a long-distance DR solution. The long distance meaning you don't want to be in the same power grid. You don't want to be in the same earthquake zone, right? So you want your DR site to be somewhere far away. And when it's far away, synchronous replication cannot be used. So you need something that's asynchronous in nature, something you are willing to take some kind of downtime for your recovery, right? And so these are the types of typical topologies customers have. So there's an active-passive failover. Sometimes this can be an active-active. That means you have two sites both sides are being used, but for different purposes. And then you have a bidirectional, right? So you can go from one side to another and back. And then last but not the least, you can have multiple sites having a common recovery site. And this is typically used in remote offices, branch offices. You might have a lot of offices, let's say in the Europe region, EMEA, and then you kind of have a central site where everything is replicating to. And any of the sites can use your central site as a recovery site. Right? So the other aspect is obviously metro DR solutions. Metro DR solutions have a flaw in that they can be taken down. Both sites can go down in the event of a disaster, like you see right now in Houston, unfortunately, right? So in those situations, but what they can give you is unique in the sense you can immediately recover because it's like instantaneous. These sites are within 10 milliseconds of latency, so you are able to commit your data only when both sides of the data is written to. So you kind of get zero RPO and RTO. Right? So there are situations where customers need these kinds of recovery options, but usually it's kind of a tiered solution where you have metro DR for local disasters, and then when you have major disaster, you're actually doing a third level where you're actually going to a remote site. Mobility, right? You can have you can actually move your app. Let's say one of your data centers that you're on, you have to do maintenance on. You can actually move your entire thing to the second data center, run your stuff, and then when your maintenance is done, you can move over. So that's the second solution. And then collaboration, right? Here you have, you can have things like Oracle RAC running on the two different sites, and you can have, things collaborating across the two sites, right? And then just wanted to mention that vSAN, after version 6, we have something called Stretch vSAN, where you can have vSAN across two data centers, and eventually, hopefully, we would use a similar scenario in an Amazon solution as well. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the RPO, the RTO relating to cloud, right? So if you look at the cost, right? If you look at traditional recovery mechanisms, the costs were pretty high when you had your own dedicated data center and stuff like that. So as you go down to the right, you see that DR to the cloud gives you a lot of feature sets, as well as it's not very expensive because it can be on demand, That means you don't need to, primarily if you think about it, what do you need to have on the DR side? Most of it is just the data. Make sure your data is being synchronized on a regular basis. And when you actually have a disaster, you can actually ask for the resources that you need on demand. So that's kind of what this provides. There are other solutions like cloud backup and other things that are very cheap, but the recovery time can be very long. So that's the big difference. So in AWS, right, as it stands right now, what is DR in AWS, right? This is kind of an AWS diagram on how they do it right now. So if you're a VMware shop, you will have to do things like AWS import export, or you kind of have a direct connect and you kind of dump to an S3 bucket, and then you recover from that. So this is kind of the situation as before the new solutions that we're going to have, right? So this is how it is. And then the other aspect is you could do it in a for a multi-tiered environment, you would have a lot of synchronization happening. You have a database level synchronization, you have app level synchronization, and you have a web level synchronization as well. So these are kind of the solutions that exist right now, right? And if you look at them, they are, first of all, the first solution I showed you, you need a conversion. You're going to convert your VM to EC2, which is kind of a painful process, and you don't want to be converting at the time of a disaster, right? And then it's a manual process. It's not automated in any way. And it's very difficult to meet your RPO and RTO requirements because it is a lot of, you're going from one platform to the another. And also for testing, right? Testing DR would be very complex and very time consuming. So, and last but not the least, you don't have an automation. Automation has to be built by you from the ground up. And it's not run books and stuff like that. You don't have it automated. So now I'm going to pass it on to GS to talk about the cloud solution that we have.
Yeah. So more than likely, you've seen the announcements related to the VMC on AWS solution, VMware Cloud on AWS. I'm just going to reiterate just a little bit of that before we start talking about what we're working on in the DR space of that. But the idea is to provide the same experience that you're getting now managing your VMware environment, providing that on top of Amazon. So all the things that you're used to working on and managing, vCenter is going to look the same, hosts look the same, all that interaction with your workflows is going to be the same. Just the difference is that VMware is going to take care of everything on the back end. We're going to take care of getting things updated. We'll keep them upgraded. All of the back end processes will provide that as a service so that you can just focus on managing your environment and doing the things that you want to do with it. Thinking about the same thing from a disaster recovery standpoint, we want to build on top of that. So utilizing tools like Site Recovery Manager and vSphere Replication provide disaster recovery as a service built on top of the VMware Cloud on AWS. And same idea, what you get with Site Recovery Manager. If you're familiar with Site Recovery Manager, it provides a level of automation and orchestration of your disaster recovery plans. If you're familiar with it, we provide that. The idea is to provide that same functionality with this DR service. One of the other things that we're looking at as well is integrating with other services that AWS offers. There's a lot of different things that AWS can provide, and this I'm going to have to just kind of leave to your imagination, but there's lots of things that AWS can provide. If you imagine your data center existing, your existing SDDC existing in a place where you could easily access all the different services that AWS provides, there's lots of things that you could creatively do from a DR standpoint or just from a daily operations standpoint. So the intent is to do as much as possible there as well. So one of the specific things that we're working on around Site Recovery Manager is around version flexibility. So one of the issues right now, if you're familiar with managing SRM, is that SRM requires the same version of vCenter at both the source and the target site, the protected and the recovery site. And while that can work for a single customer environment, when you talk about a solution that we're providing in the cloud and more from an on-demand standpoint, we want the ability to iterate in the cloud more frequently and not require you as the customer to repeat those iterations. So if we want to upgrade things in the cloud environment as we're advancing things and improving things, we don't want you to have to, on your site, have to follow along with that in order to gain those benefits. And so the idea is to decouple SRM and vSphere replication from being tied directly to a specific version of vCenter, and just make those interoperability work a lot easier. The other main thing that we're working on is improvements as far as UI, and I have a little bit of a better view of that picture, and I've got a whole bunch of demos that I'm going to go through here in just a minute. But the idea here is this is all HTML5 based. No Flash in it at all. It's all built on the Clarity UI standard that VMware is adhering to across all of our different platforms, all of our different products. And you can see that there's some, if you're familiar with Site Recovery Manager, there's some familiarity there in terms of what you see, but at the same time, we tried to maintain familiarity, but we also did a lot of work, and we're doing a lot of work in this space to improve on workflows and make things easier to work with, easier to use and interoperate with. We didn't want to just do a direct port of the existing solution over to this new idea and take any of those issues with us. So let's just kind of go through this process. So from start to finish, what it would look like is you're going to have something along the lines of, this is roughly what VMC on AWS looks like when you log into it. And the idea is that we'd have this option for add-ons, and you'd have the option of adding on something like site recovery. So just a little bit of a closer view of that. Select that's what you want to deploy. And the idea here is that on the back end, you click that you want to do that, and on the back end, we're going to take care of getting all of those pieces related to Site Recovery Manager and vSphere application deployed in the background. And this would be deploying the vSphere application appliances, getting those configured, set up and everything, deploying the SRM appliance, getting that set up and configured. I don't know if anybody's ears perked up there when I said SRM appliance, deployed and configured, but that was... So SRM appliance, that would be Photon based. That's what we're working with right now, what we're working on. Get all those components set up in the background. And then when all of that's done, we give you the option of downloading, clicking on downloading the components for your on-premises installation. So getting those on-premises components installed and configured. If you've never installed or configured vSphere application or Site Recovery Manager before, those installations are really simple, quick, easy to do. I've got a video out there online. That's what these screenshots are from, where I got the VR appliance deployed in about 5 minutes and fully configured and ready to go within about 10 or 15. And then Site Recovery Manager takes about, add on another 10 or 15 minutes, especially if you already have the Windows VM ready to have Site Recovery Manager installed on it, all set and ready to go. Obviously you're going to want to have, before you do this, it's a good idea to have your DNS in place already, your IP addresses picked out and all that, those kind of things. You're not going to need any kind of an SRA since we're using vSphere application. So if you're familiar with SRM, SRAs are just required for array-based replication. For vSphere application, you don't need that. And we would just be using the embedded vPostgres database with SRM as well. If you're not familiar with that, We introduced that in version 5.8, and it supports the full scale and scope of SRM. So if you're ever doing a new install, regardless of whatever environment, do an install of SRM, unless you're really attached to your other database, the vPostgres is a nice way to go. So let's talk a little bit about the pairing process. What is that going to look like? And let's show you what this. So this is the UI. We're just going to go ahead and select a new pair. Select our on-prem vCenter. Type in the name of our cloud PSC. Type in our credentials, all the standard stuff. And then you're just going to pick which vCenter you're going to connect to. This is one of the cool things that's unique to this, is that you'll notice that we don't have a separate pairing process for vSphere Application and Site Recovery Manager. We've merged those two together, so it's just a single process. And you'll see a lot more of that kind of thing as we go through the rest of these demos. So we're all ready to complete. Click Finish. Just wait a second for the screen to refresh. And there you go. We have that pair all set up. We're just going to log into, now that we have the pair set up, we're going to log into the cloud site. And there you can see now we have that the summary screen that you're probably used to with all the detail about those. We had to, can't see the version number there. That's why that little block of white is there to block that out. But you can see those details about both Site Recovery Manager and vSphere Replication. So just make that whole process really easy and have that taken care of in just about a minute. And if you're familiar with, or even if you're not familiar with Site Recovery Manager, one of the next things that you have to do is we need to get our inventories mapped. So you've got VMs that you're protecting on premises, and in the cloud you need to figure out what networks, if it's connected to this network on premises, what network are you going to connect it to in VMC on AWS? If it's in this folder on your site, what folder is it going to be in there? Resource pools, all of those kind of things. So let's walk through a little bit of what that looks like. So we've got network mappings, folder mappings, resource mappings. And there's two different ways that we can do this. We can do it either manually, or we can actually have it be handled automatically. And automatically what it's going to do is just map. If you have names that match at both of your locations, it will automatically match those for you. But if you want to handle things manually, you can do that as well. You can see we can also set up the reverse mappings so that we have that in place, and then we're also able to set up a test network. So if you're familiar with the way that Site Recovery Manager works from a testing standpoint, that gives us that isolated test network to work with. So here with these folder mappings, we're going to handle these automatically, and you can see that we just select the data center, and it automatically is going to detect that we have 6 folders that have the same name and get those already mapped up. Check a box and do the reverse mappings, and we're good to go. And then we'll do something similar with the resource mappings. Just check which ones we want to get mapped. Same thing. Add those mappings, and we're good to go. Have that process all taken care of. And then lastly, the thing that you have to do is just define your placeholder data stores. This is one of the things that Site Recovery Manager requires is you need, it's going to create a placeholder VM at your recovery site, and it's just gives you an idea, a visual representation of where it's going to actually recover that VM. And then there's a few configuration settings that you can make on that placeholder VM. If you want to have different resource settings or make some other customizations to the VM, you can do that on the placeholder VM. So next, let's take a look at what that protection workflow looks like. when you go through the process of actually getting a VM protected, what's that gonna, how does that compare? How easy is that? So here's your VMware Cloud environment. That's, if you're familiar with the host client, the HTML5 host client, it should look pretty familiar. So we've got a group of VMs. We'll say these are 3 marketing VMs that we want to protect. So we're just going to select that we're going to configure those 3 for replication. And you can see this opens in a separate window. And the reason that we're opening that in a different window from the regular client is because we're offering this the HTML5 both in the VMC on AWS environment, but also on your on-premises environment. So we needed to be able to do that in both. So required having that pop out as a separate window if you're curious about that. So select where we're going to replicate those to. Pick the data store that those are going to go to. Obviously, in this case, just going to be a single data store, that single data store that we provide. Select our RPO, all the usual configuration settings that you're going to have with VR. And then the cool thing here is now, usually that would be the end of that configuration setting with VR, and then we would be looking at going into SRM to start the next part of our configuration. And you can see now that we've configured the replication, now we're going into protection group configuration. So we can actually add a new protection group, or add it to an existing one, or even not create a protection group now if that's, just depending on what we need. Same thing for a recovery plan. We can add it to a new recovery plan, use an existing one, whatever. And we finish that workflow, and now it's going to go through and do that whole process for us. Instead of having to replicate VMs individually and then go into SRM and protect them, we can handle that whole process all in that single workflow. You can see here that we've got our VMs doing their initial sync. Again, all the things that you're used to seeing in terms of vSphere replication configuration, we just make that a lot more available, a lot easier to look at. We can see that those VMs have been added to that protection group, and then we can see that recovery plan that contains that protection group has been created and the direction that that's flowing. And again, you can take a look here and see, look at the details of our recovery plan. We see that we've got those 3 VMs protected in there. And let's just say that, for sake of our demonstration, we want to change the priority group for one of these VMs. So just like it is with the regular web client, it's really easy to go in there. We can change the priority group from one of those VMs from 3 to 2. That reflects, and then if we go take another look at the recovery plan steps, we can see that that's reflected there as well. So next and the last demo that I want to show you is, now that we're talking about getting those VMs protected, what does an actual failover look like? And then one of the key points that I really want to hammer on here is, since this is based on, the whole idea here is it's based on the existing tools that you're using, vCenter, Site Recovery Manager, all of those things. You don't have one of the problems that you have in a typical environment where it's that protection is one way. It's really easy to protect your VMs and move them up into the cloud, but then if you want to go back the opposite direction, it creates, there's complexity or difficulty or additional steps that you have to take, whatever. So the whole thing that I'm going to demonstrate here is, since we're using Site Recovery Manager underneath, it's, you can protect your VMs up to the cloud, and then just like you could normally, you can reprotect those and fail them back over in the opposite direction. There's nothing unique about either one of those environments in terms of protection. Whether you want to run your workloads in the cloud and protect them back the opposite way, or vice versa. Either way works, and either way is totally flexible. So let's take a look at this one. So again, same environment that we were looking at before. We've got our 3 different protection groups, 3 different recovery plans, and let's go ahead and create a new recovery plan that's going to be our entire site. So we want it to contain all of our recovery plans. Go ahead and select all of those. Confirm that our test networks are set up the way that we want them to be. Finish the creation of that. And we'll go and select that recovery plan. And go ahead and kick it off. And within Site Recovery Manager, you've got a couple of different options in terms of how you want to run that recovery, the planned migration or the disaster recovery mode. And if you're not familiar with it, really the only difference between those two is how SRM is going to respond to errors. And what I mean by that is when you're running in planned migration mode, the main concern with planned migration is you want all of your data, you want to move over and have everything go within the plan exactly as you expect it to. You're more concerned with getting things moved over according to that plan, not so much concerned about how long it takes. In disaster recovery mode, we don't really care about things going exactly, all of the steps being completed. We just want to get our VMs up and running at the recovery site. And what I mean by that is the steps that you're going to run through in a plan are the first thing that you're going to do is you are going to replicate your storage. So just imagine if your recovery, if your protected site is a smoking crater, we don't need, and we send a replication command, that command is more than likely going to fail. So in a planned migration, we would want to stop right there and figure out, more than likely if our protected site was a smoking crater, we wouldn't be running a planned migration. But let's say that we went to run a planned migration and that first step fails. We want to stop right there and figure out why did that fail. Let's get that fixed so that we can continue with this. In disaster recovery mode, that step's going to fail and we're okay with that because we know that that replication is not going to work because the array is, a smoldering hulk. So just keep moving on, and then you go through all the steps with that same idea. If it hits an error on the way in disaster recovery mode, it's just going to keep going. So in this case, we're going to run through in planned migration mode. So we've got all 9 of those VMs that we're going to be recovering. You can see that we kicked that off, and it's we succeeded in synchronizing the storage. Then we're going to shut down those VMs at the protected site. Again, if you can imagine, if we were running in DR mode, and you go to shut down VMs at the protected site, again, that's going to fail. And if you're in DR mode, we don't care that fails. So we're not going to sit and watch that whole plant. We just accelerated through it a little bit. You can see, if you're kind of curious, if you look at the start and end times of this plan, it only took about 3 minutes to run before it was complete. So you're not talking about a lot of time in that whole recovery. So now if we log into our vCenter within VMware Cloud on AWS, we can take a look and see that those VMs are there and they're running. Just an example, if we go back to our original site, you can see that those VMs are now not running. They're actually, at that point, we refer to them as shadow VMs, but because they're not quite a placeholder because we haven't run this reprotect process. So we're going to run the reprotect process. What this is going to do is just reverse replication and reverse protection. So get those VMs replicated back from AWS back to our on-premises, and then get the protection settings all configured and set up, recreate those placeholders, and walk through that whole, fairly simple little process, but a nice thing to have, just having it be that single click of getting that reprotect taken care of so that you don't have to think about, your workloads are protected and you're all set and ready to go. So at this point, we're ready to run a recovery from AWS back to our local site. And we could, at this point, the thing that I would usually recommend is you'd probably want to run a test unless there was some reason that you were in a hurry about it. But, however you wanted to work it, you've got that capability at that point to run that back in the opposite direction. So we've talked both about the problems with existing disaster recovery. We talked about some of those challenges, some of the opportunities there, and then I walked you through a lot of the things that we're looking at with VMC on AWS, some of the directions that we're interested in going in terms of providing a disaster recovery service. I would ask, please fill out your surveys. I know from what I've heard, the filling out the surveys is a little bit harder. We really do appreciate the feedback, both positive and negative. I got a little bit worried because one of my standard jokes is I usually say, if you liked the session, please fill out your survey. If you didn't like the session, just don't fill out your survey. And I think too many people might have been taking me up on that or something. So really, if either way, we read all of the comments. The ratings are important to us. Our bosses ask about them. And we really do appreciate the feedback. Every year we work to try and make these presentations better. So anything, feedback that you have, input, we appreciate it. I wanted to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So we're here for your questions. We've got a mic up front. If you just want to stand up too, I can repeat the question and we can go with that. So, questions? Yeah?
Perhaps I'm behind. The last of you that vSphere replication only supported asynchronous mode?
Yeah, so the question was, does vSphere replication only supports asynchronous replication? That's correct. Yeah, vSphere replication currently supports a minimum RPO of 5 minutes. Anywhere, RPOs from 5 minutes up to 24 hours. One of the challenges that you're going to have in any kind of cloud environment, if you're interested in synchronous replication, is getting that synchronous replication, because the latency, to do synchronous replication, you're going to need, around 5 to 10 milliseconds of round trip latency. So it's not something that initially we're looking at using vSphere replication to provide that. There are some other things. Mohan hinted at a little bit, when he was talking about vSAN stretch clusters as other options, but yeah.
I understand you have to have low latency, but in the instances people could get near the Virginia or Oregon availability zone and solve for that. But if people solve for that latency, then
and it is something that we're looking at for vSphere replication. The current iteration only supports up to a 5-minute RPO, but working to reduce that latency is definitely something that we're looking at.
Yeah, to add to that, if you think about AWS, right, you have availability zones. So within the region, you have availability zones. So the replication you are asking about is within a region. That's where you get the latency to be less than 10 milliseconds. And so you would use stretch clusters concept rather than the replication concept for that, because you're writing to both places at the same time.
Yeah.
So that way, vSphere replications limitations don't affect you if you use that.
Yeah.
So those solutions we would hopefully build over time.
Yeah, and one of the other things that we are looking at as well is the possibility of, obviously we're still looking and working on the idea of the disaster recovery as a service feature, but one of the things that we're looking at within it is the idea of introducing other vendors into that space as well. So something like a recover point for VMs where you can get asynchronous replication. So that's a potential possibility.
Probably not Zerto?
Possibly. I don't know. My biggest concern with Zerto still, and obviously take anything that a competitor says about a competitor with a grain of salt. is they're still using an unsupported API for their product. And you look at a comparable solution like Recover Point for VMs or even Veeam, obviously, those are competitors to SRM, so hopefully that gives me a little bit of credibility in what I'm saying. But they're using the vSphere APIs for I/O, the VIO, which is fully supported, works great. I don't know why Zerto isn't. So, and as a customer, I would have a concern about that. But.
And the other aspect as well, one of the things you might be wondering about, like things like databases, right? You would want to kind of layer on top of your DR something like a replication that the database themselves provide, so that will give you a very robust solution, like DataGuard or Always On, things like that. So that's kind of how you build on top of this. So it's not that, the limitations of vSphere replication is not the only thing you should be worried about.
Yeah. Yeah.
What if I just want long-term archival stuff in the cloud?
So if you just want long-term archival in the cloud, I would think that would sound more like kind of some kind of a backup to the cloud option. I'll be able to provide some level of testing or something like that. That's something that we're the thing that we're initially looking at is more of an active solution where you have it would be a place to run active workloads, whether or not or have that. And one of the things I didn't really talk about is SRM fully supports the idea of running in kind of an active configuration. So you could run production workloads at both sites, or run a lower tier of workloads at one site and production higher tier at another, and then have as part of that failover be shutting down or assigning less resources to the non-critical workloads to make space for your production workloads. So, don't think of, when you think of disaster recovery, don't think of the target site where you're going to potentially recover to as something that always has to sit there unused and waiting to be failed over to. There are ways of getting use out of those resources. Now, I've got a session this afternoon where I talk about some of the compromises that you make with that. As with any design decision, there are trade-offs. When using your environment like that is going to create a little bit more complexity, and then it also presents some challenges in terms of if you're going to use your environment like that. When you think about how long your disaster occurs, is that going to be okay? Like if what you're doing as part of your recovery is, say, your tier 3 and tier 4 workloads are running at your recovery site, you have a disaster, you fail over there, and you either power off those tier 3, tier 4 workloads, or you just assign them a really tiny amount of resources so that they're kind of just barely operating. Well, that's going to work great for a short period of time. Your business is going to be happy that your tier 1 and tier 2 are working great. But at some point, those people that are using those tier 3 and tier 4 are going to go, we still do need to use these things, so what's your plan for that? And a solution like VMC on AWS could provide a really nice opportunity there, because you could expand that out as you needed to relatively easily, especially in comparison with other places. Mm-hmm. But it's all just things that you have to think about, all balances that you have to weigh in.
And the other thing I just want to mention is, obviously now if you're running on AWS, you have S3 and you have Glacier, so you can leverage those. So a lot of solutions you would see over time that would kind of do your archival and be able to recover from the archives.
Yeah, but kind of going back to the original question, initially we're talking about an active solution. But we definitely are looking at the possibility of other solutions that would be more, have less resources that are sitting there active in the cloud. More just kind of a use it when test it when you want to use it, something along those lines. So, yeah.
I understand. Confirm SRM 6.5 now supports vSphere replication on defaults.
No. Sorry. So it supports vVols it supports, just to be really clear about this, 6.5 supports vSphere replication. VMs that are running on vVols can be protected by vSphere replication and protected with SRM. It's not using array-based replication with vVols. Okay. Okay, so yeah, just to be clear, okay, yeah, okay. Yeah.
The others would be nice.
Yes, no, yeah.
So, because that's new with 6.5 release, right?
Uh-huh.
Kind of confirming that. So you can have vVols with vSphere replication on-prem to vSAN.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's the great thing with vSphere replication. I apologize, I didn't hear that part. I'll be totally honest, the SRM support for vVols is a little bit of a touchy subject. Just out of curiosity, I really am totally curious. How many people, are anybody using vVols right now? No, got one. Anybody, for any of you other people that aren't using vVols, is SRM's current lack of support for vVol array-based replication something that's stopping you from using vVols? Anybody? Yeah. Okay. And that's why it's prioritized the way that it is. So yeah. But yes, back to your original comment. So vSphere replication supports anything where any storage that's supported for vSphere replication would work in this, as a source for your replication to VMC on AWS. So whether it's vVols, local storage, NFS, iSCSI, block, whatever it is, it would work. So, yeah.
Are there any plans to scale vSphere replication beyond 2,000 VMs?
Are there any plans to scale vSphere replication beyond 2,000 VMs? Yes. Yeah.
What are you targeting?
Okay. I don't know that we have specific targets in mind, but we are definitely working on improving that.
So we're still on vSphere 6.0 using vSphere replication.
Okay.
Maybe this is already in 6.5 and I just don't know about it. Is there a way now to update a VM's configuration without having to break replication and then reset?
Well, so you're talking about resizing VMs in order to, and specific, right now vSphere replication requires that you go through a fairly painful process if you need to increase the size of a VM's disk. So that's in 6.5, that's still the case. That's something that we are definitely working on. Again, I can't get into time frames or anything, but that's one. Yeah, and that's one that we're working on for a future, and that's actually something that I'm also working on right now, working to create a vRealize orchestrator workflow that would go through that whole process for you. Again, just make that process easier. But obviously, that's kind of a temporary solution or more of a backwards compatibility solution. So, but we are working on building it into the product as well. So. Any other questions? So is array-based replication supported? You're asking about, is that something that we're thinking about for VMC on AWS? Yeah, right now it's not, just because the thing with array-based replication is it requires this similar hardware at both ends, and it doesn't really fit into a cloudy environment. So it's not really something that we're planning on.
But vendors like NetApp and all are also present in AWS clouds, so that could be a possibility in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it might be something that you might be able to do on your own, but it's not something that we would provide as a service, I don't think. So, is there anything particular about array-based replication that you?
We are talking about everything, storage, virtualization.
Right. Well, and that's what vSphere replication gives you. vSphere replication gives you the ability to replicate from any storage to any storage.
My question was, is there a roadmap for integrating that into the cloud, the VMware cloud?
Well, but you're asking about array-based replication. So replicating, right now for array-based replication to work, it requires similar storage. vSphere replication doesn't require similar storage, and that's why we're going with that option. Any other questions? Yeah.
You spoke about EMC, VMware,
Recover point for VMs?
we're thinking about using that for our active sites.
So you're talking, now just to be clear, you're talking about recover point for VMs or? Yep.
That's something that you would recommend for active sites? Recovery or any other technology?
Well, what do you mean by active?
Active standby.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you ask me, I'd recommend SRM with vSphere replication. But that's but I do work for VMware, so that's, yeah.
Any other technology other than array-based?
Yeah. Is there something about SRM with vSphere replication that wouldn't work for you in that case? Yeah. So, I mean...
It's just another thing that I have to conquer rather than, everything with recovery point for VM. Everything is integrated in vSphere.
Well, and you get the same thing with Site Recovery Manager and vSphere replication. Like, and when we're talking right now, we're not talking about, the thing that we're looking at or, the possibility of VMC and AWS. I'm just talking about, existing Site Recovery Manager with vSphere replication. Recover point for VMs is just a competitor to that. So it provides similar functionality. If you look at what Site Recovery can do in terms of array-based replication, it can do things that Recover point for VMs can't. Just depends on how you compare the two. Really, if I was going to talk about competitors, though, Veeam would be another one that I know they have replication and some availability solutions that they've been working on for a while. That if you're going to look at competitive stuff, that's. But yeah, you'll come back to SRM.